Hello there guys, and welcome to Mad Doc Minis. In this video I'm going to be converting this Impulsor into a Primaris Ambulance. Now this thing is part of a kind of failed project of mine for the channel where I was trying to make a Cobra G.I. Joe inspired Space Marines. Something that, had a lot of memories from when I was a kid. I thought it'd be cool to do Space Marines, but it didn't really take off when I put my feelers out on the channel. So I'm going to be repainting this bad boy to be the ambulance. Now I've chosen the Impulsor because of all the nice space that we've got in the back. It's kind of ripe for this sort of conversion, I think. I have heard of people doing apothecary rhinos and stuff before, but I don't think I've come across an Impulsor. At least I haven't personally. I'm sure other people have done it, but I'm trying not to kind of look at anything because I want to do my own thing here. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm going with it. Stay tuned if you're interested. The first thing I do is to assess the troop area of the Impulsor. We've got a long bench down the starboard side here and a shorter bench on the other side. The shorter bench is going to go because I want to create a little bit more space inside this thing. Now, if I hadn't actually built it up already, this would be a much easier job to get rid of that bench. You'd have a separate component you could work with like this, and it's quite easy to modify when it's not already attached to the rest of the vehicle. In this case, because I want to recycle this vehicle, I'm going to have to do it on hard mode. So I go ahead and grab a razor saw and saw vertically through the bench carefully, trying to miss details inside of the Impulsor that I want to keep. I have to do it on a slight angle, as you see here, and once I've gotten all the way through, I pry that bench off with some hobby snips, which leaves a little bit of a mess behind, which requires some tidy up. And I do that primarily with a sharp craft knife, just to make everything nice and flush and just better looking, basically. After that's been shaved down, it looks a little something like this. I do cover that up later on with an offcut of plastic, but it's nice and flat now, which is good enough. Next, I start thinking about the patient bench that I'm going to put on the starboard side of the vehicle at the back, and I use this old intercessor as a bit of a measuring guide to make sure that the bench is large enough, basically, to accommodate a Space Marine. So I've got this offcut of Fomex, and I'm just having a little look and sizing it up against the Space Marine to make sure it's the right width, which it is. So I go ahead and use that, although I do need to chop it down, of course. So I need to take off a little square in the corner just so it sits flush with the control panel inside the vehicle. And after I've done that, like so, I need to then cut it down to the right length. So I make a little mark just inside the chassis there, and then cut it down with several smooth passes of a sharp blade. And that is the basis of the apothecary bench, although I am going to detail that out more, including putting some surface detail on it. And I decide to use this little offcut of, this is like a kind of ducting material for an air conditioning unit. And I've got some left over from another project, this little bit here in fact, so I decide to use that. I chop off these funny pegs off of the end there and give it a little bit of a tidy up, cut it down to the right size, and that's going to give me some much needed texture, although I don't glue it on quite at this phase. I also start to think about the bench not really having sufficient support underneath it. Bearing in mind this thing needs to look like it can support a ton or a ton and a half worth of Space Marine in armor, if that's the weight. I don't even know how much a Space Marine is supposed to weigh. Put it in the comments if you do, but it doesn't look like it'll support it at the moment. So I decide that it needs some kind of support or legs underneath it to make it look a little bit more plausible, and I go with these Lego lightsaber handles. Now I can almost hear you lot groaning, me and my Lego. But I don't mind the use of Lego in these kind of projects. I know many do, but it's really, really useful, and it offers a quick fix for things like this that you're not going to pay that much attention to, but are somewhat noticeable. So I just trim those down to the right kind of size, and then use a couple of them as basically sci-fi table legs, guys. That's kind of what it amounts to. And I just super glue those in place once I'm happy with the position, really. And that's what they end up looking like. Not perfect, but they do the job. I then decided to glue that bit of textured material down on top of the workbench area, working quite quickly as I did so, because if you're super gluing anything to Foamex, the reaction is virtually instantaneous and doesn't really leave much room for error, quite frankly. I then snap off the old intercessor from his base. I can do that because I've only ever used super glue for my miniatures, and it's really good if you like recycling old miniatures like I do. And I do a little bit of a dry run to make sure he fits nicely on the bench, because this guy is going to be the actual patient. I then break off his backpack. That's going to get put to one side because his equipment's going to be in there with him. I kind of figured that it would be very valuable. It's part of the very valuable asset that a Space Marine is, so they'd look after all the equipment as well. So that's going in the back. Similarly, the helmet comes off in much the same way. I'm going to be using a bare head on this guy, but that helmet is going to be put in the back of the vehicle as well. So that gets put safely to one side. I then do another little bit of a dry fit just to see how he looks like lying down. Not very natural, not surprisingly, because it's designed to stand up. So I decide that I need to modify the legs and snap one off pretty aggressively, as you can see there, and then do a lot of jiggery pokery and back and forth, really trying to get the leg in a good position, really, which is easier said than done, but it is possible with a little bit of perseverance. I'm just trying to get as natural looking a lying down Space Marine as I can, basically. But as you'll see in later footage, he does change somewhat, but I'll let you discover that later on. But in the meantime, I just go back and forward, trying to get the position right with this guy. And once I'm happy with that, I then start to think about arms. And it's a good opportunity, if you're doing anything like this, to use some of the goofy arms that you tend to leave behind on the intercessor sprue. Things like the one with the open palm, that came in quite handy. I chopped the hand off there and positioned it as if he was kind of holding onto his leg. It's just a nice way of making a more interesting looking miniature, and that's kind of what I ended up with at this phase. Not bad. I then get a bare head with an unusual looking gas mask on, which kind of reminds me of a medical oxygen mask, which is why I used it, and I'm putting that on top, and that's going to add a little bit more to the story and diorama in the back of the Impulsor. You can see that when we put him in the back of the ambulance, he actually looks quite good. It's fairly natural, actually, which I'm really pleased about. I'm not really a diorama person, but I'm happy with how this turned out. Next up, I primed the whole vehicle, or I should say overcoated it, with Standard Mechanicus Grey, which is the base colour of my homebrew chapter, ready for more extensive painting later on. But it was a good opportunity to get that done and to tie a lot of the conversion work together that's been done so far. I then started to think about the apothecary himself. I used this guy, which I've had for ages and ages and not built up, which is the original Primaris Apothecary, and I built him up torso and legs just to get an idea of positioning inside the vehicle. And I start to build the scene really together. Yeah, quite a lot of modification to this guy, and I'll go through that in a sec. But in the meanwhile, you'll notice that the guy inside the ambulance has had his leg chopped off. That's very deliberate, because I kind of figured that he'd need to be badly enough injured to warrant him being in the back of this thing in the first place. So unfortunately, he had to lose his leg. Poor guy. But never mind. It does make for a more convincing scene in the back of this thing, I think. As for the apothecary himself, yeah, a little bit of conversion work here, nothing too heavy, more of a kit bash really. I decided not to use the specific backpack that he came with because it was kind of a waste in this environment, and it will be valuable for conversion work later on for something else. So I just used a standard Primaris backpack there. I also used a little bit of a arm change. I used a standard intercessor bolt rifle arm for the right arm, and moved the kind of medical instrument that he used to have in his left arm over to that arm with a little bit of cutting and changing. I used the original apothecary left arm and then put an open palm hand that comes on one of the arms in the intercessor sprue. So just a little bit of chopping and changing, guys, but I think well worth it, because when you bring the two of these miniatures together, it makes for a really interesting little scene. And as I said, I'm not a diorama person. I don't like dioramas that move around on the tabletop. My one exception to that is things that are going on top of or inside vehicles. I don't mind that for some reason. So that's why I tend to get my creative juices flowing when I'm doing things like this. But as you can see there, I think the scene looks really, really good, and obviously looks a lot better when it's all painted up. So stick around for that at the end, guys. But yeah, I'm really pleased with how those two came together. If you've enjoyed the content, guys, please consider liking and sharing. It really does help my little channel to grow. And if you're not already subscribed, consider giving us a sub. There's plenty more on the way. Really appreciate your time in watching the video. I'm not going to go into detail on the painting work because this isn't really a painting channel and I'm not that good. But I hope you enjoy the final glamour shots. And I really enjoyed this project. So thanks ever so much for joining me. Cheers.